I'm just going to show one image, which I'll talk about towards the end, so you can be tantalised by thinking about what the reference will be for the thatched cottage. Can I first of all just thank the organisers, UCD and the National Library, for the invitation to speak today. I was involved at an earlier stage in the discussions about what this might become, and it's terrific that it's actually going ahead now, following that slight involvement earlier on. What I want to try and do in the time that I've got is cover a range of issues raised by today's subject, and also indeed the previous speakers, in more of a polemic than a recap of specific projects. And I'd like to start by questioning the language that we're using, and especially the term "the public." There's no such thing as the public, and I think we all know that there are many publics. And neither do I think is there a consensus, even in this room, about what the public means. There's certainly not a consensus in the sector in which I work about what the public means. It's a movable discussion, and I've been involved over the years in many and regular debates in the arts in general and the visual arts in particular about the ideas about public funding, public space, public institutions, public art, public as audience. And in many of those discussions, I often suggest that we replace the word public with the word social. What would happen if we were to talk about social funding, social space, social institutions, or social art? Now, I should say that when I say that in discussions, sometimes people hear the word socialist rather than social if I say social art. And whatever the merits or demerits of socialist art, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about a different understanding and the introduction of the idea of transaction into our thinking about these ideas, and the idea of transaction changes the notion of public from passive audience and passive consumer to the idea of public as active participant in a reciprocal transactional process. And as a result, this nourishes a reciprocal process rather than an inherited rhetorical process. A rhetorical process does not expect an answer, and it holds authority to itself. So I'm talking about a different understanding of that set of relations. So I'll be talking, and I'm talking about and arguing for a shift towards reciprocal relations and away from inherited rhetorical relations in terms of the subject we're addressing. And for me, this means to think and to work in 4 dimensions. There are a number of dimensional modes of practice already at work in our culture, and especially in the visual arts, and I would characterize them as follows. The one-dimensional model is the idea of the solo genius, the gifted individual who is involved in self-expression, where the production and the value is ascribed to production in the studio. A very good example of this in terms of I'd say the mythical position that the artist Francis Bacon occupies, and Francis Bacon conspired in the creation of this myth. He talked about pulling images off his nervous system, as if it was a sort of almost an involuntary Tourette's response to reality. Yet the work that the Hugh Lane Gallery has done in archiving the studio, the brilliant archival work and analysis that has been done, shows that there was hardly a more considered artist than Francis Bacon. The myth was, and it was perpetuated by critics as well as the artist himself. The artist conspired in this notion. The idea that he would produce 20 canvases and destroy 19, and then you would have the masterpiece. What the archiving that the Hugh Lane has undertaken has shown is that while the studio to some people might look like chaos, it's actually a different kind of order. It is not chaos, it's just a different ordering of material. So that idea is there's a number of vested interests who perpetuate that idea that is the ultimate value. And obviously, having been involved in third level education, it's highly problematic that is projected as the ultimate model that students should aspire to when they think forward into their days as practitioners. The two-dimensional model is where the value is at least acknowledging the role of distribution in the way that value is conferred on art. In terms of the gallery system, so you're out of the studio and you're in the distribution system called the gallery system or the art world. At least it acknowledges that dimension of distribution that's very important. But it's a heavily mediated set of experiences that are on offer in that space. What I would call the three-dimensional model in this paradigm is where, and with particular characteristics over the last 20 or 30 years, art has moved from the gallery into the public domain and created unmediated experience of artworks. But this has mostly represented a change of location rather than a change of ideology. And that's why I think that most public art, most of the time, fails and is ineffective in terms of achieving what the original intentions may have been about actually working in the public domain. So, and the ideology remains the idea that agency in creating meaning remains with the producer, remains with the artist, that the artist has sole agency in that relationship, whether in the gallery or in the public domain, with some notable exceptions, of course, which I'll talk about in a moment. The four-dimensional model, which I'm recommending, actually includes all of the other models, but is centered on the idea of shared agency between the non-artist and the artist and the non-artist, or the non-specialist, if you like to generalize it more, in the creation and construction of meaning and value out of the experience. And that is a relational reciprocal process in which the non-artist, the non-specialist, is able to negotiate meaning and value on their own terms, at their own pace. And that is an empowering set of relations, rather than, I would argue very strongly, that the historical model we have has often been a disempowering set of relations in that space. So this is not the avant-garde model of modernism, but it is an attempt to reconnect art to lived experience. And although this is a recent dynamic in visual arts, relatively recent dynamic in visual arts, it is not a new process at all. Not in the sense in which Ezra Pound declared that the role of the modern artist was to make it new, to make it novel, which conferred a particular kind of value on the solo genius as being ahead of the public, as being separate, in advance, avant-garde. That model, I think, has been deconstructed. And outside our own culture, if we take a wider and longer view and longer reading of the human project, you can see that this idea, this transactional idea, this idea of shared agency, is available, as I said, in other cultures. If we look beyond, the Dogon tribe, who live in sub-Saharan Africa, are known for their fantastic mask making, many of which occur in Western European and American museums. But what's interesting about their masks is that they're used obviously in rituals and ceremonies. They're activated by context, and in that culture they have no value as objects, as artifacts. In fact, between the ceremonies and between the rituals, the masks themselves are completely disregarded and stored in caves and have to be almost physically remade to be used again. And what's happening here is that they are valued when in use. That is, when a social transaction and exchange and sharing of meaning is taking place. It's their purpose, not their material form, which confers value and creates meaning. There was a very interesting, very significant exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in 1984, after the museum had gone through a long period of refurbishment it reopened with a number of large-scale exhibitions, one of which was Modern Art and Primitivism. And a very important restatement of what was originally the core identity, modernist identity of the Museum of Modern Art, though I think a more accurate name for that institution would have been the Museum of Modernist Art, because that conflation of modernist and modern is actually wrong. Modernist is only one way to be modern. It's only one way to be in the present. It represents a worldview. And this exhibition was a restatement of that worldview in visual arts terms, because it assembled a lot of material from other cultures, some Dogon masks, and exhibited them in a way which decontextualized the artifacts, celebrated their ethical properties rather than their ethical properties, and described them essentially in the format of that exhibition as simply rehearsal and preparation for the ultimate art form, which was, of course, 20th century abstract American art. Now, I'm conflating the whole process here. That exhibition, occurring at that time in the mid-80s, was then comprehensively deconstructed in a series of articles in Artforum that ran over a period of about a year, led by the writer Tom McEvilley and a whole range of other people who articulated very strong objections to the validity of that restatement of that modernist principle about where value lay in culture in general in the world, and that hierarchical approach to it. And I think the whole agenda within museology, I think, shifted after that. Of course, it had been underway before that, but that was a particular pivotal moment when that singular, hierarchical, vertical, and male point of view, if you like, was deconstructed, and a field of negotiation was opened up about what museums were for, who they were for, who could be in them, who should be in them, who are the gatekeepers, and on what principles, what was the basis on which the gatekeeping took place in terms of museum activity. So this is about the idea of use value over exchange value, and the reconnection of art to its ethical responsibilities, the reconnection of its ethical responsibilities to its aesthetic responsibilities. It's not about leaving something out, it's about adding something to. It's about enhancing and enlarging the space in which we're working. In a word, an argument for this model, which I'm trying to make, of exhibition making is about them, the other, the non-specialist, i.e. those who are not already part of the discourse, our discourse. It's not about us, the gatekeepers, the priesthood that you could associate with the traditional and historical ideas of museums. And that is the us who are already part of the discourse. So if that purpose is established clearly, then form will follow purpose, always. The form of the experience, the form of the exhibition, indeed even the form of the institution, or indeed not an institution. The idea of not having an institution. The National Theatre of Scotland, for instance, after devolution took place in Scotland, it was very interesting that there was an immediate debate about having a National Theatre of Scotland. And almost as quickly there was a debate about whether it would be in Edinburgh or Glasgow. And I don't know if it was a politician, or I presume it was somebody within the cultural field, argued that it didn't have to be a building. It didn't have to be building-based. And the National Theatre of Scotland now is a non-building-based national theatre. In fact, the two guys who ran the National Theatre of Scotland recently are coming to the Abbey, so it'll be very interesting to see how they deal with the baggage here. But it's the idea of the principle is going beyond some of those conditions and properties, and certainly going beyond the assumptions and presumptions on which quite a lot of practice can be based, despite many people's efforts to change that. I would also say that in terms of form following purpose, this relates to education. As I said, I think this is a really big issue as an underpinning for this whole process. It requires us also to be very clear where we stand on the continuum between the idea of exhibition as a form of entertainment and exhibition as a form of new knowledge, in the creation of which the non-specialist can participate. And this, even when dealing with heritage or tradition, is a present tense issue, because all experience takes place in the present tense. It's a mistake that we make constantly to think that heritage is about the past. It's actually the platform on which we negotiate the present and the future. And I think that's a really important point. And I would also say alongside that idea about experience always taking place in the present tense, as a result of a project, a European funded project that the Faculty of Education ran in NCAD over the last 2 years, involved with 5 European countries, working with young people in terms of visual arts and practice and so forth, that one of the key findings from that research project was that all learning takes place in the vernacular and is most effective when it is immersive. Whether the exhibition or the reveal, if you want to think of it like that, involves material or immaterial culture. The argument I'm making, essentially, as I think I've said, reconsiders the modernist trick and what I've called in a previous presentation the Giotto problem. And that is the idea that the Renaissance, and Giotto is one of the sort of archetypal figures in art history who separated the figure from the Byzantine ground in art and created a process. Now, there's lots of debates. In fact, Valdemar Janiszek has a really interesting program on BBC4 at the moment where he is deconstructing that notion that the Renaissance happened in Italy. A very interesting argument, very theatrical, knowing Valdemar, but still very interesting challenge to the PR of Vasari's analysis of where the Renaissance happened. But and I'm not an art historian, but that key shift of separating the figure in pictorial space from the ground and the shift from the Byzantine visuality to Renaissance visuality, if you like, the beginnings of modernism, is really key in that idea of modernism. And do reconsider that modernist trick, that worldview that then ran from the Renaissance to the Reformation, to the Enlightenment, to industrial capitalism, and to information capitalism, which is what we are working through now. To reconsider this is not to be nostalgic. So I'm not a pre-Raphaelite. I'm not actually talking about going back in any way to some sort of golden space. That questioning, that reconsideration, which actually emerged substantially in the second half of the 20th century, coming out of anti-colonial wars of independence in the developing world, and I think also in Western culture by a feminist deconstruction of a particular set of hierarchical values, is not to be nostalgic, but is to argue for a shift forward to an idea of the figure in negotiation with the ground, in a tension between figure and ground. And that tension creates the space in culture for the participation of the non-specialist, and is how the passive consumer is transformed into active participant in the making of meaning in a cultural process. Culture being, in my own working definition, what we make and do to add value to the quality of our lives. This means acknowledging that different kinds of knowledge already coexist. Our problem historically has been that those different kinds of knowledges are then classified hierarchically, vertically, if you like, and given value or not as a result. And exhibition, in whatever form, in whatever situation, with whatever material content, can reveal an open rather than a closed circuitry between those knowledges in a relational field of experience which we already inhabit. in which we are already immersed. And as I said, an open circuitry that is an inclusive rather than an exclusive field of values. Because if it's exclusive, it can only be entered with permission and with socioeconomic and cultural credentials, which is a disempowering process, exactly the opposite of what we should be thinking about, I would argue. And to think of immersive is to think of the digital, not just because it's here and unavoidable, but because there's a really interesting relationship between the digital and the argument that I'm making. The digital is immersive. And what I'd say is, without tripping off into another kind of seminar, is that we could think of the digital as the new folk culture. If the digital wasn't so addicted to consumerism at the moment. And I think that's one of the challenges that we need to overcome. It is already immersive for younger people, but its dominant process is consumerism. And that is a highly problematic space that has to be negotiated as well. But the digital need not be a cul-de-sac or a consumerist terminus for meaning, as if meaning is fixed, simply to be passed on, to be consumed, rather than negotiated. And by negotiated, I mean to be made and remade on the basis of experience in any given situation or scenario. I would just have a slight caveat here in terms of recommending that negotiable space, and this is from direct experience when I was Director of IMMA, and Ruth will probably remember this. In the mid-90s, we undertook a big review. The museum opened in 1991 and was very successful. By 1995, our attendance figures were touching 300,000 people a year. So on a quantitative analysis, it was succeeding. But we had set ourselves with the board the idea that after a period we would review how the museum was working according to its founding principles. And luckily, through the good offices of a board member, we were able to commission Behaviour and Attitudes to undertake a series of studies, focus groups and so forth, and really probed how this institution was working. New institution, first Museum of Modern Art in Ireland, etc. And it was what was revealed was really, really interesting. I'll just compress quite a lot of it down into some of the key findings. And we had programmed the museum on the basis, while we were building a collection and had some donations, and we had an embryonic collection, we programmed the museum entirely on the basis of temporary exhibitions. We wanted to create a dynamic identity, and we wanted to have reasons for repeat visits to the museum. So the exhibition program, including exhibitions from the collection, changed very regularly. And when we undertook the analysis and the review, we found that of the 300,000 visitors per year, a very high percentage were first-time visitors. So the question was, well, why are they not second-time visitors? And while I would say that what we were trying to create was that negotiable space of debate to let people enter a discourse, we went too far too quickly. What people were picking up was dissonance rather than debate. And they had already got a primary dissonance in that the museum, as most of you presumably know, occupies a fantastic 18th century building, the Royal Hospital Colloquium. So there was already a dissonance there because Dublin Tourism refused to make new road signs for the Museum of Modern Art, but insisted on using the brown heritage signs. And part of our analysis showed that this was a confusion for people because their expectations, in terms of preparing people's expectations as to what the experience would be like, was heritage. And it remained dominant, even though the museum opened well and was well written about and well mediated in the media and so forth. There was enough people to be concerned about arriving at the experience, expecting it to be a heritage experience, on the understanding that somewhere in this building there was a Museum of Modern Art as well. So on the basis of that understanding, we felt that this was a qualitative issue and not simply a quantitative issue about numbers of people attending. And we embarked on a further process then of changing everything. Signage, point size for information sheets. We moved from the grey and white signage, the grey and white letterhead, the sans serif typeface, which was all about us. All the things we appreciate aesthetically, as I say, as the priesthood. And we still have, the museum still has blue and yellow in its logo, just a whole range of things right across the board in terms of information systems. Small things like individual curators signing introductory panels, suggesting that this is somebody's point of view. It is a point of view, it's a valid point of view. It might be, sorry, I'll keep going. Got to get to that slide.
Have to get it back.
Okay.
Just hit one of the buttons.
Oh, right, sorry, okay, I'll do that. Okay, okay, so I'll telescope some of this. So if we're talking then, so we were prepared, I think, in trying to address and trying to be about them rather than about us. We were prepared to undertake quite a long period of change. It was quite difficult to do, actually, because it involved changing some staff roles within the museum as well. So one of the things I'd also say is that this idea of use value over exchange value, that the artifact acquiring value through its use, through its experience, because you can't separate the concept of art from its experience, I would argue. And that suggests to me that our museum's storerooms are not full of art at all. They're full of potential art. It's like playing a musical score, and this was referred to already, I think, in terms of language. It's like playing a musical score. The artifact only becomes art when it is played in the experience. And of course, there's all the different forms of art allow that range of possibilities to take place. And if we accept that principle, that art and its value is made in the experience, where the process, not just the product, is revealed in the exhibition. And by process, I don't mean just the manufacturing process, I mean the construction and creation of meaning as a process. If we work to that principle, then this can actually happen anywhere. It doesn't have to be confined to substantial institutions. It doesn't have to be confined to metropolitan centres. This dynamic has been emerging in contemporary art now for a while, and the model has been tested across a range of situations and situated practice. Anthony Gormley, the sculptor, talks about his practice being entirely devoted to the idea of re-establishing the agency of the viewer, whether his work is shown in gallery spaces or in the public domain, and he's been extremely successful and is acknowledged critically and commercially working in the public domain. But I would take that further and say that it's actually about the creation of empathy. And empathy is the process of seeing self in other. And in my view, that is what art is for. Art of any kind, material or immaterial, is what it's for, and what it has been for over the longer human project. And it seems to me that that has to be one of the founding principles of exhibition as a means of setting up that negotiation. So the space we're discussing today, this cultural space, I would also argue, is now one of the only spaces where that emancipation that takes place through the creation of empathy can actually happen. Because I don't believe, arguably, that it is any longer available through party politics. I don't believe that empathy is available through our dominant economic model at the moment. And we seem to have abandoned many principles that were described as the post-war consensus through the 20th century into the 21st. So the stakes are very high in our space, I would argue, without being selfish about it again, without being just about us. In terms of what we should be doing, is that we're with them and for them. I think it's also the only space in this year where we can hope to reconnect with some of the founding principles that were articulated in 1916, because 1916 happened because of a cultural discourse in the late 19th and into the 20th century, which was actually transferred from cultural space to political space. And it seems to me that is one of the tasks of our sector, however we define ourselves at the moment, to engage in that process of transfer of a discourse and of values, and the creation of empathy from cultural space to political space. An exhibition and institutional processes seems to me to be some of the mechanisms that we can use to do that. And if I can call up the slide that you've waited patiently to see, which is, where are you? Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah, just very quickly. I'm just finishing, promise, I'm just finishing. I wanted to show this image because it's a John Hine postcard. Obviously, the person sent the postcard to Southampton. John Hine produced tens of thousands of these postcards, all of which were sent out of Ireland to other places in the world. And it made a contribution to a particular narrative of Irishness. This is out of a thatched cottage way in the west of Ireland, the edge of the world as far as some people are concerned. And I think it's worth considering why this image persists as a powerful image of that narrative of Irishness. And it's powerful because it works in exactly the same way as the TARDIS does in Doctor Who, the TV programme. You know, on the outside, it's a telephone box that can hold one person. But when you go inside, you're in the universe. You're in a universe of possibilities and a universe of meanings. And this is a powerful image because it works in exactly the same way, because the idea that has the power is that if you enter that cottage, you enter a whole culture. You don't just enter a finite experience of the cottage. Now, we can argue about how accurate that image is or the justification for it and so forth, but it is undoubtedly persistent as a powerful part of that narrative of Irishness that we are renegotiating. But it's extremely powerful, and it's powerful partly because it was also distributed widely. The photographers who created these images for John Hine, and in John Hine's postcards, we did a big exhibition in the mid-90s of his work and how the images were created. The team of photographers didn't believe they were making photographs. They were creating the material to make postcards. As you know, if any of you are familiar with the John Hine postcards, which don't look like this anymore, the sky was always blue in these. Because the photographs that the photographers brought back of an actual landscape were then retouched according to John Hine's Quaker belief in the evangelical and positive nature of colour. So he was engaged on a particular narrative, and the images, and we could be here for days on the John Hine project alone, and I'm sure somebody has been at some point. But at that idea that when you go through that doorway, you pass into a whole culture. And I would say that the grammar and syntax of our exhibitions should do no less than that, wherever they take place. And my final proposition is that we should think as if this space is a template for the National Library, National Gallery, National Museum, Irish Museum of Modern Art of the future. Thank you very much.